a good friend.
Hello. Welcome to The Revealing. I'm your host, Pavarotti, here to discuss the Idaho 4 case. As a disclaimer, this channel is for entertainment purposes. These are my opinions. I'm not here to slander anyone. And why don't we just get started? Today, we're going to dive into that timeline as it relates to Mr. Kohberger and events surrounding the investigation of the case after November 13th. What I want to do in this one is introduce all the known facts of the case as we go through that timeline. I'm probably not going to dive in too deep in what anything means on this one because there is a lot of information. It's going to take me a few. I will, however, touch on one specific aspect of it that we've never touched on before, and I think I can enlighten you on some things. So sit back. This is what I've titled Moscow Unalivings 3, The Investigation. Okay, we're at the Moscow Unalivings. I'm going to stay YouTube correct on this one, part 3. And this is the Kohberger's timeline. How does his timeline relate to the events and the investigation? Let's get right into it. Before we go too far into his timeline, though, we need to recap where we're at to this point. And that's the history of the Moscow Unalivings. And again, we've got the arrest of Kernodle on August 21st. June 22nd, we got the Hat Rock arrest. We got the Quad Cities Drug Task Force pouncing on them, trying to turn them into informants, which they do successfully. September 13th, it becomes public knowledge. Kernodle accepts the plea deal. September 14th, major arrest in Moscow. TF and TR arrested on trafficking charges. We identify them as Aryan Circle. October 21st, TF and TR are released from the county jail. One on furlough, one on bond, $75,000. Then on November 11th, the last shoe fits, the last thing to hit the ground hits the ground. The Hat Rock accepts a plea deal, and that becomes public knowledge. November 13th, the atrocity on King Road occurs. The two ladies who took the deals, their two daughters, were in the house. Now, where do we go from here? Let's get into the investigation. I'm going to go through this kind of swiftly. I'm not going to point out a lot of things about this because this timeline is kind of extensive. But starting with the atrocity on King Road on November 13th, it looks like I've got 2022-22, so I'll have to fix that. But November 18th, the first significant thing happens in the investigation. Kohberger registers his car in Washington and is issued a front license plate. So before November 18th, he didn't have a front license plate. After November 18th, he did, and his car was registered in Washington. That'll be important later. November 20th, 2022, DNA from the knife sheath is submitted to CODIS. Okay, so folks, for those of you out there that think that the knife sheath and the DNA was planted, I'm sorry to tell you that it just wasn't, okay? Because they submitted it to CODIS on the 20th. That means it's in there. They didn't know anything about Kohberger on November 20th, so they couldn't have submitted his DNA trying to set him up at that point. It's just not possible. So his DNA was on the knife sheath submitted on November 20th because it's locked in. There's no changing it after it goes into CODIS. Now, November 25th, a BOLO goes out for a 2011 to 2013 Hyundai Elantra. As we've already discussed, looking at the PCA, the FBI expert looked at the Hyundai Elantra seen at the atrocity and identified it as a 2011 to 2013. Certainly not a 2014 to 2016 as it's later stated. So we know that's not Kohberger's car. November 29th, WSU officer compiles all the Elantras on campus at Washington State, but he notices Kohberger's has a front license plate, so he just puts it in the database with the other ones and moves on with his life. Nobody cares to look. It wouldn't have mattered anyways because that's not the Elantra seen at the atrocity. We'll later discover that. November 29th also, FBI contracts with Othram Labs on this date to begin an investigative genetic genealogy search. So So that started November 29th. Now from December 2nd through December 6th, we have a little timeline here for TF because he's arrested up in Spokane on his absconding warrant, and he's transferred back to the Latah County Jail during those days. Then on December 8th, an Amazon warrant is returned to law enforcement, totally redacted. Right now we're getting back into all the redactions. It's been my contention that that Amazon warrant came back to Kohberger. Well, it didn't come back to Kohberger, it came back to a lot of people, but Kohberger was later identified by informants. December 14th, the search warrant's issued for Brent Kohberger's apartment. We know that because watching the police cam video, they let him know we have a search warrant to search your apartment, Mr. Kohberger. So that search warrant was issued on that day because that's the day that they go out and implore the search warrant. December 15th, Kohberger is shot by police during the search. Also on December 15th, later on that day, Kohberger's pulled over with his father in Indiana. It's my contention that was just a simple drug interdiction stop. He asked the officer about the Kohberger shooting. Just another tie right there. Don't let anybody tell you Kohberger is nowhere involved in this case. They're steering you wrong. Now, December 16th, TF is transferred from Judge Megan Marshall to Judge John Judge's court. Interesting date. December 18th, a warrant is returned to law enforcement from Reddit. Now, what could have been on that Reddit warrant returned? I think maybe you're going to start seeing some conversations on that one that they would not know about at that time, but they would later figure out that Mr. Kohberger and Mr. Kohberger talked to each other through Reddit. The investigation is continued. December 19th, TF and TR are given an extremely generous plea deal that I've titled the Deal of the Century. Also on that date, according to nothing other than an insider leak, nothing has ever been made public about this other than that magic newspaper leak, that results are back from the IGG, according to the insider leak. Nothing else tells us that. So, in my opinion, that leak on the IGG was said to cover the informants turning in the people that they turned in. Now, whether they turned in the right people or not, that is of great contention. I contend that they didn't. I contend that they set him up. And I will go into a lot more about that in future videos, but right now I'm sticking to the facts. December 20th, Detective Payne admits in court the other day that this is the date he gets with WSU officer about Kohberger's Elantra. This is the date the investigation actually started. Now, December 20th to 23rd, this is when all this takes place now. Detective Payne pulls Kohberger's license, identifies his bushy eyebrows, as if that is an identification. Then, Detective Payne finds out that on November 18th, Kohberger licensed his car in Washington. His front license plate was issued. He must have figured out right then why they overlooked the car initially. He also gets, I don't even put it on here, but this is also when he gets with the FBI vehicle analyst, and he analyzes video of Mr. Kohberger's Elantra and identifies it as a 2014 to 2016. This is when Mr. Payne adjusts the PCA to read 2011 to 2016 to make Kohberger's car fit the narrative, even though it has clearly been identified as not the original car seen at the atrocity by the FBI expert. Then, Kohberger's 8458 phone number was compared to the FBI unmasking of all the phones in the area of the atrocity. This is the tower dump. And he was found not to be in the area based on that. So, when we look at this right here, I'm trying to figure out what Detective Payne used to get that search warrant for Mr. Kohberger's phone. Okay, he found his phone number in a traffic stop. He found out that he registered his car on the 18th of November. His license has bushy eyebrows. There's nothing else in there that would give a judge reason to issue that search warrant. So now you go back to December 19th. The judge is not going to issue the search warrant based off of experimental IgG investigation, folks. Not going to do it. They will issue that search warrant based on the other circumstantial evidence and the information from an informant, which is why Ann Taylor, in all of her motions, always puts in the cases that discredit the informants, because she knows without that informant's testimony, without their words, they would have never received the search warrant for Mr. Kohberger's phone on the 23rd. Plain and simple. Now, let's take a look at that now, though, because I'm going to show you something you've never thought of before, or you probably have never thought of before. December 23rd, 2022, Detective Payne obtains a search warrant for the 8458 phone number for 24 hours prior and 24 hours after the atrocity on November 13th, 2022. Now, in the recent court hearing, they put Detective Payne on the stand, and Ann Taylor was grilling him in the fact that once he received the initial search warrant for the 48 hours, that he almost immediately filed for the search warrant for 6 months prior to the atrocity, the historical cast. And a lot of emphasis was put on how could he have created a cast draft with all of the locations of his phone for that 48 hours so fast, and then got the historical warrant after that. They then put Cy Ray on the stand, and Cy Ray testified that there is really no way that they could have mapped out his cast location in the amount of time it took them to receive the first warrant and then file for the second warrant. It wasn't possible. Why did she do that? See, nobody's figured that out yet, but I'm going to go ahead and tell you. Because they're focusing on what was used to get the warrants, not the information received. You see, what they used to get the warrants, the first one was information from an informant. For them to get the second warrant, the historical data, they have to be able to somehow verify that the information from the informant is true, or the judge won't issue the second warrant. If not, they would have ordered the first two warrants simultaneously, but they couldn't. They had to get the first one for 48 before they could get the second one for 6 months. So what would they have found in such quick of a time in that first warrant to get the judge to issue another 6 months worth of cast data? It wasn't location, folks, and that's what they're trying to allude to. They're trying to allude to the fact that it was the informant that they used, that they relied on to get the search warrants and their information. Because here's what happens when law enforcement gets your phone and they get a warrant to view what they're going to call the cast data, but it's also the trap and trace. See, they weren't looking for where his vehicle was location-wise. They may have done that afterwards. They were looking for who he was calling and texting on his phone. That's what the warrants for the phone was for. And once they verified he either called or texted what the informant's information was, they verified that, then they gave proof to the judge that the informant had credibility, and the judge issued the next 6 months search warrant. Take a look at this investigation.
Well, I want to start at the beginning. Ritter looks through Charles's messages from earlier in the day.
2:15 p.m. yesterday, Cedric Warrior texts my victim, says, "I'm coming to Tulsa. They want 500 if you could hold them till tonight. They gone, be sold. Let me know ASAP because they're trying to go back to Muskogee."
Cedric, maybe the middleman.
So the location data, yeah, that's important. That comes later. What they were looking for was who had he talked to? Who had he texted? Who had he called the day before and the day after the atrocity? Who had he called and texted and talked to 6 months prior to the atrocity? See, folks, nowhere in this entire probable cause affidavit do they mention drugs. And let's finish the timeline and we're going to discuss it further. So, once they verified who he had talked to, then they pulled the 6-month prior cast data on the 23rd. And they went back and they may have logged some of his location trips and tried to word it in a way in the PCA that it was potentially stalking. And we all wonder how the judge and the prosecutor have vehemently eliminated the stalking aspect in court. See, I knew they were going to do that. And I told y'all in advance before they actually verified it that they were going to eliminate the stalking, because those trips that he made into Moscow, once they got his historical cast data, they could see on there that there was probably texting, a lot of texting involved, that those were trips of Mr. Kohberger to go and pick up illicit substances. They read it in his text messages. They didn't put it in the PCA because they don't put drugs in this PCA because it hurts the college. They tried to keep all this out of it. This is why the defense would prefer to keep some of it private, and the prosecution absolutely would, because the prosecution doesn't want drugs getting attached to this thing any sooner than it has to for the college. But the defense doesn't want drugs getting attached to it any sooner than it has to because of the stigma that somebody who uses drugs has on their head. It will demean Mr. Kohberger's character, not propel it. So, back into the timeline, December 24th. Kohberger is located in Pennsylvania using a TLO search and locate tool. They had no idea where he was. They found him in Pennsylvania using a search tool. December 29th, the search and arrest warrants issued for the Kohberger family residence in Pennsylvania. They arrest him. On March of 2023, this timeline continues. All of a sudden, TF is sentenced on his deal of the century. Around the same time, 28 members of the Aryan Nation drug trafficking organization are arrested. Some of them arrested in prison for these offenses. In fact, several of them. They ran the thing from prison, folks. Now, continuing on, because Mr. Kohberger is supposed to have a preliminary hearing on the evidence to see if he has enough evidence to go to trial, but instead, in the shadows, and May 15th was one of those shadow days where this secret grand jury was convening, and just so happens on that date, TR testifies via Zoom in a hearing, supposedly with Judge John Judge. But coincidentally, the next day on May 16, 2023, Kohberger's indicted via the secret grand jury indictment. So that is the timeline of events. If you had any questions about dates on certain things, I hope I've solidified those questions for you. And going forward now, we're going to take this timeline and I'm going to show you how it correlates to future events and past events. And I'm going to show you how we solved this bad boy. All right, until then, we'll keep going. So in the next timeline series, I'm going to dive into each aspect of it, and I'll show you what it all really means. As it relates to that phone record search, though, you should now have a pretty good understanding of what was going on. You see, if an informant gave law enforcement Mr. Kohberger's name because they were involved with Mr. Kohberger in illicit activities, the first thing that they would have done when they received that first search warrant is verify. Has his phone number contacted the informant's phone number? Or has his phone number been in contact with somebody who was in contact with the informant? They went through and they verified who he was talking to verify the informant's information. Then they got the second search warrant to further verify the informant's situation. Then once that was verified, then the cast data on his location started to get put together. That's how the investigation went. And that's why the initial search warrants on the phone were so important to law enforcement. It wasn't to see where he was. That may have been part of it, but it was to see who he was talking to, what he was talking about. And they learned a lot from that, I'm sure. But until next time, please post your thoughts, your criticisms. Like and subscribe to the channel. Pavarotti's out.